So glad to have back on the program Joan McCarter, senior political writer at Daily Kos. She writes about and covers Congress and specifically the Senate. And of course, last night was a big night, a historic night in the Senate. And yes, we saw democracy defeated as the protection of a procedural maneuver, a measure, was seen as more important than voting rights. And of course, two Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, making it all happen and helping Republicans rule from the minority. Joan, welcome back to the program.
I'm glad to be back. Not thrilled with the topic, but thrilled to join you again.
Yes, and well, there is a lot to parse through because it as I said, was a historic night, and there were some really powerful speeches. And I think Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin probably didn't think they'd be as isolated as they were. They did stand their ground, but talk a little bit about your feeling as you watched it all.
I was proud of 48 Democrats, many of whom were a little bit waffly on this issue before it came to yesterday. One in particular stands out for me, Maggie Hassan, who is in a race this year. She's running for re-election this cycle and she's from New Hampshire and has been pretty cautious, pretty careful on things. She was part of the bipartisan group that ended up derailing Build Back Better by pushing the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But she stood on the Senate floor in an impromptu speech answering Tom Cotton's challenge about all of the signatories to a letter back in 2014 saying they didn't want to get rid of they didn't say they didn't want to get rid of the filibuster. They said they wanted to protect the minority's voice. She hadn't planned on speaking. She wasn't on the list. But when she heard Tom Cotton trying to use this, she stood up and gave an excellent speech calling out Republicans for being anti-American, for being anti-voter, for what they were doing yesterday. So there were some really, really strong speeches. It was fantastic to see 48 Democrats say, all right, enough's enough. We have to restore the talking filibuster. We can't let this happen. And that part of it was good. That part of it was really good.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about how this kind of thing doesn't often happen, where you know where things are going. You know what's going to happen. And I think it's probably what Manchin and Sinema were banking on and counting on, what usually happens. You know what's going to happen. Why should you take a risk? If it was going to be done, if there was going to be a carve out, if Manchin and Sinema were going to agree, then yes, all of you who either have had reservations or are in very tough races, yeah, we need you. Go ahead. It's worth something. It's even worth maybe losing. But this doesn't usually happen, where the people who either had some real reservations, like a Dianne Feinstein, or just traditionalists, right, or people who really are in tight races, still vote on principle, knowing that it's not going to turn out that way, and they're just voting to send a message. And I think that's a fundamental turning point in terms of how progressives have really moved this issue.
I think it is. It was really kind of heartening to see 48 Democrat, 50, because Manchin and Sinema were there most of the time too, all 50 Democrats sitting in their seats all day, one by one, rising up to talk about the importance of this. Angus King, who was a late signer on, gave an extremely good speech. John Tester, all of these members who had been kind of wishy-washy, coming together, committed, obviously, sitting in their seats all day to give these speeches. That showed a level of cohesion that I don't remember having seen before. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out going forward for Manchin and Sinema. Because I really get the feeling that they're kind of going to be frozen out. Although the caucus has to be very careful in doing this, because At any given point, they could just decide to switch parties. So there's a lot that needs to get done before that can happen, like tons and tons of nominees, executive and judicial. But I think in terms of the social atmosphere of the Senate, I think yesterday was a breaking point. I think it's going to be very hard for Manchin and Sinema to continue to have good relationships with the Democrats in the caucus.
Yeah, and I want to get to them and what happens for the future in a second. But I want to talk a bit more about the 48 and sort of what they did and what this means moving forward. Especially you talked about Maggie Hassan, like she realized she could not let those comments by Tom Cotton go unchecked, and she gave that powerful impromptu, those impromptu remarks that were really powerful. And it seemed to me to signal that someone like her is going to move into the election in 2022 really wearing this as a badge of honor and instead of running from it. And I think that's a change too, right?
Because I think that has to.
Her opponent is going to try to use it, and I think she's going to say, no, I did the right thing.
After yesterday, they can point to every single Republican running against them and say, this person does not want you to vote. This person is trying to take your vote away, and I'm going to stop that. It's a powerful message, and I think that they're going to be a lot more willing to use it. The other thing that I think is really good is that we are really that much closer to getting rid of the filibuster as it stands now. I think we're really close to actually being able to get a talking filibuster if we can keep the Senate.
Right. I mean, because it obviously, I mean, just a year ago, the idea of this was kind of crazy, where you might see this happen. It's been mainstream. The whole idea has been mainstreamed. And the fact that they were talking about simply a talking filibuster, the Republicans and Manchin and Sinema really had no, they had nothing to stand on here, because that really has been the modern tradition of the filibuster, if they wanted to talk about tradition. So,
right.
They really were exposed, I think, in that regard.
And I think, too, the best part of how that played out last night was that we actually saw some of it. We had the exchange between Ossoff and Collins. That was actually debate, in which Collins did not come off looking particularly good. But that there were glimmers of this, of what Democrats were trying to make happen. They were trying to get something on the floor to happen again that's substantive, that informs voters, that constituents can look at and understand that this is a body that really, truly does deserve the title of the greatest deliberative body in the world. We saw some of that last night. So it was really interesting. And it was also interesting. I was watching in my Twitter feed. I've got just a list that's Capitol Hill reporters watching sort of the surprise among these people who report on the Hill every day that there was a debate happening on the Senate.
Right.
And it was substantive and it was interesting. It's like, well, yeah, that's what Democrats have been talking about.
We even saw those exchanges between Cory Booker and Raphael Warnock and Tim Scott, like a black Republican and two Democratic Republicans, like talking about these issues and taking, they were taking on Tim Scott and his defense of the Republican Party stance.
Which was extremely gratifying. Cory Booker's speech, if you haven't seen it, folks, go watch it. It was masterful. It was very good. And it's encouraging to see that we do have senators that can do this. Warnock and Ossoff were amazing. Angus King was extremely good. There were just some really terrific speeches last night.
Now, something else happened, getting to Manchin and Sinema. I thought, and I had tweeted this at some point in the night, Biden's press conference was really important before this because he was confident. He was, he copped to where he made mistakes, but then he stuck to his guns on where Republicans have been obstructionists. He kind of brushed off the media hyperventilating and high drama. and he was on the offensive, and it was Manchin was like on the defensive with that big sign, and we've never done this. And I mean, I think he didn't think he'd be in this position of having to stand there defending the filibuster, because he didn't think this kind of vote would happen. And then we had Sinema. I mean, this is another thing that hasn't happened before, I think, where she's literally in the hours before this vote losing major endorsers and people who've raised money for her. Emily's List, the group that is her largest fundraising group, that was pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, they've cut her off. They warned her before the vote that they would, and when she didn't listen, they said, "Okay, that's it. You're out. You're off our list." And that's pretty big. Planned Parenthood, NARAL, all of the big organizations for women's rights have cut her loose. And this is important too. We've been working on the filibuster at Daily Kos for so long, for like 16 years. This has been an issue that we have been hammering at Daily Kos. And one of the problems we've had all along has been with some of the pro-abortion groups, because rightly they're concerned that what that would mean for, well, Supreme Court, that's gone now, but what it could mean legislatively when you've got a Republican Party intent on taking the right away. Now they see how it's been flipped, and they're on board with filibuster reform too, which is another reason why I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. But for Sinema specifically, that was big. And I think it's going to start coming home to her. All of those handshakes she got from Republican senators on the floor last night isn't going to mean a whole awful lot for her going forward.
Right. There's always been this speculation that she's not going to really run for re-election, because how could she, by angering the base so much that really worked hard to get her out, to get the vote out, and it's not like she won by this huge amount, and she needs those people and those activists. And Arizona just continues to turn blue, and the Latino community continues to be very engaged and active. And, there's been that speculation, well, maybe she's just going to, become a lobbyist or whatever. And that may not be true, but it seemed to me like after losing these groups and their support, even if she was thinking of leaving, there's no turning back now and saying, okay, I want to run anyway again, because it's going to be very difficult.
There's not. And I think I have a hard time with her history seeing Republicans truly embrace her unless it's for an issue like last night when they can use her. She's not going to be able to get Republican votes, not substantial numbers of Republican votes. She's certainly not going to get Democratic votes at this point. In terms of turning into a lobbyist, she may have blown up all of her bridges there too, because she's proven herself to be distrustful, untrustworthy, and she's proven that she'll stab you in the back. And that's not something that very many groups are going to be anxious to bring on board.
Yeah, and I mean, the Republican Party in Arizona is one of the most radicalized in all the states.
They're still trying to overturn the 2020 election.
Right.
Yeah,
it's totally Trumpified. The idea that she's going to walk in. I mean, I guess she's thinking of independents, which there are a lot of, but. I mean, would she mount a run as an independent? I mean, then you're doing something
I think
that's
probably
yeah.
She would try. She thinks she's the next Maverick. She really does think she's the next John McCain. And I think, we saw speculation last week in a popular Twitter feed about how people who are close to her supposedly are telling her, you could run for president, you could be the middle ground candidate, the not Republican, not Democratic, independent presidential candidate. Whether or not that's true, I can see her, having those kinds of ambitions somewhere. I can also see her being deluded enough to believe that could happen from what we've seen of her thus far.
Right. Now, You noted that civil rights groups are, they have no choice but to keep fighting. And, they said they'll never stop fighting to preserve and defend the rights for which their predecessors bled and died. We only have a minute, but where do you see the fight going now? How do we move on?
The fight is going to have to be from the Biden administration and the Department of Justice. Where it can, what tools are still left to it, in whatever executive actions Biden can come up with to try to protect votes. It's going to be kind of hard to rely on the courts when you know that you've got the Supreme Court at the end, but potentially between now and the election of 2022, state and district courts could do some good. But what we really need to do is localize this fight and support all of the civil rights organizations in every Republican state to do everything in our power to help folks vote in November. Mm-hmm. I just, we've got to take it away from the federal level and look at state and local and do the on-the-ground grassroots work to help people vote. There's no other way.
Really important. Joan, always great to get your perspective, and thanks so much, as always, for coming on today.
You are most welcome. It's always fun to talk to you.
Joan McCarter, senior political reporter at Daily Kos. Follow her on Twitter at Joan McCarter. We're back in a few minutes.
Michelangelo Signorile on Sirius XM.